Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, friends, I see some familiars, a lot of new faces. Welcome to today's conversations, EVZ conversation, Children Uprooted, Children in War, Helping the Victims and Prosecuting the Perpetrators. My name is Matthias Nellis. I'm not with the EVZ Foundation, but I have the honor and the privilege to guide you through today's evening. And the EVZ Foundation, for those who don't know very briefly, is the, of course, Foundation for Remembrance, Responsibility and Future. And it worked a lot with Ukraine over the past. And since its creation, it was in 2000, 2003, it had over 700 projects with over 2,000 partners in Ukraine. And I have to say that I was one of the recipients of I participated in one of these projects in 2016-17. We created anti-corruption walks in Ukraine. So this is just a small example of how even experts who work on the topic come in contact with the foundation. And my name is Matthias Nellis. I'm an expert on Ukraine, and I've been living and working on Ukraine for the past 8 years. And before we begin, today, of course, is the 1st of September. It is a very special day for Ukrainians usually. It is the day of knowledge, the first day of the school year, something that Ukrainians cherish very much. It is a joyful day, and just this morning I was scrolling through my Facebook and saw, even in times of war, a lot of joyful pictures of parents and their children with vyshyvankas and beautiful attire. So even in times of war, this day for some is joyful, but of course, as we know, since the Russian full-scale invasion, it is not joyful for many millions of Ukrainians, and only 1/3 of the schools, as I was told, have decent bomb shelters. So just while we look at these joyful pictures, we cannot forget that for the majority of children this day, any air alert means an interruption of education. So today we're going to talk not about the millions of Ukrainians who are displaced or had to flee abroad. One of the most heinous and most terrific, it is the, politically speaking, the abduction, legally speaking, the forcibly removal or the forcible removal and the deportation of Ukrainian children. We're going to look at the scale of the crime. We're going to look at what it means for the children, what it means for the families, what it means for the communities, and we're going to look at how we as European civil society actors, as European governments can help the affected children and their families, but also, most importantly, what can we do to help bring back children? Because as you know, only few have been returned, and we'll come to that. And lastly, we're going to look at at the accountability dimension, how we're going to prosecute the perpetrators. As we know, Putin is wanted by the ICC, and we have a marvelous panel to explain each of these dimensions. So we have, we also have one voice of one child that we're going to show in a video to showcase what it means to be deported and separated from the parents. It's something very, very troubling and very difficult to see, what we decided to give voice to one of the victims in the form of about 5 minutes video. But with me to discuss this very serious but very important topic are 4 distinguished speakers. From my very right to my very left, on my very right is Dr. Elina Steinerte, who is a Latvian human rights lawyer and academic with over 20 years of experience. And she's a visiting professor of law at the Jersey Law Institute and a visiting fellow for human rights at the Center for Human Rights of the University of Bristol. I'm sorry. And most importantly, she co-authored a very important report that we're going to talk about quite a lot today by the OSCE on the forcible removal or the forcible the deportation. So she was one of the 3 co-authors of this report, and we're going to take a lot of her knowledge on the subject. And on my right is Dr. Andrea Despot. the CEO of the EVZ Foundation, who, as I said, has been working very much with Ukraine. And she has a PhD in Eastern European history and is an expert on historical political education and cultures of remembrance, something that is also very important when we talk about how to prevent these atrocities from happening in the future when we look into the Russian society. On my left is my former boss, and many of you know her well. Is Boss Sin, yes. Marie-Louise Beck. A long time, for over 30 years, she has been a member of parliament since 2017. So during Maidan, she was one of the politicians who was a lot in Ukraine, and ever since has been a face of the German politicians, very fervently supporting the Ukrainians in their cause. And since 2017, she has created the Center for Liberal Modernity, LibMod, where I also worked with her. And on her left is Anna Lenschowska, a psychologist and trainer and a coordinator of educational projects for teenagers and Ukrainian teachers. And Anna, of course, is a Ukrainian herself and director of the Kiev-based NGO Toler Space. And she also works...
Nice to meet you.
She works with projects, historical projects on being uprooted, and maybe that's one of the first segues to this topic, because she works with teachers and children who have been affected by war. We'll come to that. But as I said, I want to begin with Elina, because she has been the co-author of this OSCE report. She was 45 OSCE members have commissioned 3 distinguished law experts to write a report in 3 weeks. So it's a very short time, but she traveled to Ukraine. She spoke with many experts, many affected people on the ground. And Elina, why don't you kick our discussion off by describing what your mission, what you were tasked with, and what you weren't tasked with, and give our audience a kind of understanding of the scope of the alleged crimes and the forcible removal and deportation of the children. So what have you been looking at, and what have you found?
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having me here. And thank you for giving an opportunity to speak about the OSCE report that I, as Matthias said, one of the co-authors of. Ironically, this report was triggered under the so-called Moscow mechanism of the OSCE. For those of you who might be a little bit familiar in the framework of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, there is a human dimension element to it. And there is what is meant to be, was designed to be a rapid response mechanism for instances where a state feels that a situation is escalating, which might lead to serious gross human rights violations. They can trigger this so-called Moscow mechanism, and it's so-called because it was agreed in Moscow, ironically. It was 1992 when the mechanism was first established, and it was quite dormant. It was only operational until 2022, I think about 10 times or 11. And then Ukraine, the full-scale invasion happened, and Ukraine triggered this Moscow mechanism already 3 times. So the idea of this is that eminent experts from the member states, and there is a whole list of these experts from all OSCE member states, are selected to look into specific topic. Ukraine triggered this mechanism most recently on the 4th of April 2023, so roughly, 4 months ago. And 3 experts were selected, of whom I was honored to serve as one. The mandate was to look into forcible transfer of Ukrainian children from Ukraine to occupied territories or from occupied territories to Russia. And the mandate was to look into situations that may amount to violations of international humanitarian law. So very legal reports looking into Geneva Conventions and the breaches associated with Geneva Conventions, looking into violations of international human rights law, and looking into war crimes and crimes against humanity. The mandate was also to look into possibly documenting and ascertaining of the potential scale of the phenomena. In accordance with the mandate, so when the mission was triggered, we also traveled to Ukraine. These days, one cannot just jump on a plane and fly, what normally would be, 2-3 hour flight. It took us 2 days in cars to reach Kiev and 2 days to come back. And we spent some time in Kiev meeting with a whole host of both authorities and civil society. And then we produced the report, quite a lengthy one, which I'm sure some of you may have read, and if those who haven't, you are very welcome to read. That's the gist of it.
And help us to make sense of the scale, because there's a lot of numbers, and the report, I have to be very precise, does not verify any of the cases, and it doesn't say how many victims are actually affected. But as a human rights lawyer, they help us make sense of the scope of the alleged crimes, because Ukraine says it has identified about 20,000, and the Russians have said that they have evacuated, so-called evacuated, up to 700,000. So how do we make sense of the scope, and how do we actually go about recording these instances of forcible transfers?
There are a couple of caveats what I think is absolutely paramount that we keep in mind when we discuss the phenomenon, when we speak specifically about numbers. So first of all, let us not forget that there is an active warfare going on in Ukraine. And therefore, any precise accountability, precise putting your finger on exact numbers on any issues in Ukraine is exceptionally difficult, because the bombs are flying, the buildings are being destroyed, people are being killed as we speak, and it's very difficult simply to keep track on what's happening. So first of all, this context needs to be taken into account. Secondly, when it comes down to deportation of the population, civilian population, not just children, civilians generally, there is obligation on Russia also to keep track of these numbers, because of course Russia has the physical custody of these individuals, right? What the mission established very clearly, this is an obligation under Geneva Convention number 4. Russia does not comply with this obligation. There is no National Information Bureau established, and therefore, to a certain extent, when it comes down to verifying data, Ukrainian authorities are yet again in a really no win-win situation, because they have no opportunity of exchanging information with those who have physical custody of these individuals, not just children, civilians altogether. Now, at the start of the full-scale invasion, it is correct, Russian authorities were talking about as much as 750,000, the numbers were floated around. What was unclear, whether in those numbers Russians were actually counting families who have voluntarily left, because many families have links in Russia, just decided that it's safer to go to Russia, all sorts of reasons that individual families made on the individual basis. So, and of course, Russia did not provide any explanation of this data whatsoever. Since then, we know that Ukraine has established a platform. It has complied with its obligations under Geneva Convention number 4. It's established National Information Bureau. And for all of us in audience, we know there is Children of War website, which tracks the numbers in terms of how many children are lost. What was not entirely clear to us as a mission when we were in Kiev is the verification process that is embedded in verifying the data which actually then appears on the website. Mm-hmm. There certainly are very stringent steps taken by Ukrainian authorities to do their utmost, but the reality of the situation is such on the ground in active war zone, and may I underline that once again, active war zone, sometimes one can only manage that much. So we know that we are talking about large number of children, not 10, not 100. These are thousands. Whether they are exactly 20, whether they are somewhere a little bit less, unfortunately, the phenomena of the war situation is such that we simply cannot put that finger on exact number.
Okay, thank you. That's very important, I think, to caveat when we hear the numbers and there's a big range. Anna, I want to turn to you. We have talked a lot. You're an educator and you work with teachers and other multiplicators and children as well affected by war, not deported ones yet, but I wanted to ask you to help us make sense of what the deportation or the removal of children from their usual environment to Russia in this environment means for them and for their identity. From your perspective as an educator, what does it do with these children?
Yes, since 2014, me and my colleagues are working with displaced children, and that were those who were displaced from one region of Ukraine to another. And now we speak about the situation of stolen children and deported children to another country, to aggressor country. And it deeply impacts formation of identity of children and teenagers, and total mechanism of mental health development. It impacts tremendously. Also, depending from age, there are different age differences, and impact on each age is different. Even if it is an infant or a small child, it also then is an attachment trauma and certain things that then can appear in an adulthood with these people who can have different traumatic remembrances and sometimes such situations that I don't know exactly who am I. We know stories of Holocaust survivors who had several names, several stories, and then only found out that I have this identity actually. And also we had a joint project with 4 countries, and also there is a Nina Ludras is here who worked before for Kreisau initiative, and it was a project about uprooted stolen children in World War II. By Nazis, stolen children from Germany and Central and Eastern Europe, and they were going through so-called process of Germanization. And we know now accounts of those people who are now old people who try to find out who they are exactly, and that's very fundamental disturbances that happen to you if you are abducted as a child.
Thank you. We'll come to how we help the affected psychosocially in the second part, but Andrea, because your project was already mentioned, it's the question of parallels is always, or the question is a tricky one, but as a expert of cultural remembrance, how do you look at the deportations? What analogies and what parallels with the past 70 years do you see?
Well, let me start by saying that abduction of children, unlegal transferal or deportation is sadly and bitterly a strategy of war that has been known and applied throughout history and throughout the regions. As we speak, these type of war crimes or grave violations of children's rights are committed worldwide, on every corner of the world and on every continent. Now, having said that, of course, sitting here in Berlin and representing the foundation that I do, of course, the analogy comes to mind that during Nazi Germany, hundreds of thousands, potentially children, have been abducted by the Nazis in Poland, in Slovenia, and in other countries. What it does to people, and I think in this sense, it's perfidious in a double sense. It's a war crime, most likely, and it amounts to war crime and to genocide, ultimately, as far as we know. And I believe the legal experts have little doubt that we are witnessing a cultural genocide unfolding before the public eye. On the one hand, and at the same time, we have the aggressor calling the Ukraine a Nazi regime. So I think the analogy has many dimensions, or at least those two dimensions to it. And then a last remark, which ties into what Anna has just said. Let me quote a champion of children's rights, an educator, a pedagogue, Janusz Korczak, who has accompanied his fosterlings to Treblinka and who has given his life. He could have saved his own, but he accompanied 200 of his fosterlings because he didn't want to leave them by themselves. And let me just give a quote which also basically shows how infamous and how perfidious this war weapon is that has been applied to Ukrainian children. He said, "Children are not the people of tomorrow, but people of today, and they should be allowed to grow into whoever they were meant to be." And I think this is something that you were just addressing, exactly. Because what abducting them and subjugating them to Russification, which takes place, or to naturalization processes, prevents them from enfolding or from becoming these individuals that they should have become in the first place. And I believe this is something that we will have to cope with in the decades to come.
Thank you. Marie, you just returned from Ukraine, I think Monday. Last week you were in eastern Ukraine, in Kharkiv and Izium. And I wanted to ask you, we come to the political prosecution of the judicial prosecution a little bit later, but you have a long perspective on also war crimes. You have been witnessing and observing the war crimes of the Yugoslav wars. So with your longue durée perspective, looking at these abductions, what is your assessment of why the Kremlin is doing that? Why are Ukrainian children being deported from Ukraine?
It's it's a very simple answer. It's about destroying a people, period. And like Hitler, what for a long time political leaders did not want to believe, expressed totally clear in Mein Kampf what he was going to do in case he would come to power. Putin, totally clear, explained what his goals are. He says there is no Ukrainian nation. And anybody who claims to belong to a nation like Ukraine, or those who claim that our children are Ukrainian, they speak Ukrainian, they have grandparents, they have remembrance, which, by the way, is Ukrainian. Just think about the Holodomor. This is supposed to be destroyed. From Bosnia, where we saw this very well-orientated violence against women, it also was about humiliating men, that they were not able to protect their women, their wives. This, I think, also is always an aspect in that. But I think if you look at the deportation of children, and not only deporting them, but immediately taking away their identity, giving them Russian passports, forcing them to speak Russian, influencing them with aspects of history which are just turned around, because Putin talks about fascism in Ukraine, and what you have in Russia is a totalitarian system. Let's not fight whether we can call it fascism or neo-fascism. It's totalitarian, definitely. So everything is turned around. And if you use the German word verrückt, something is being positioned from one place to the other, and that makes people crazy. And I think all this is we are dealing with. I just come back from Izium. This city has been under occupation for 6 months, and the people I talked to, I think all you can do is call them survivors. Of course, we asked, do you have knowledge about children being deported? She said yes, but we have no figures. We don't know who still is alive. We don't know who still is there. They were 50,000 people. Now there are 25,000 living in ruins. And what it does to children being deported, and we all know about the kids being brought to Great Britain from Jewish families, at least they were not taking away their identity. So there is a difference in that. What is happening in Russia is destroying their DNA, their historical DNA. And I'm very convinced that every people has a historical DNA, which is history, and even if within the families there is no open talk about it, even if there is taboos about it, it's there. Mm-hmm. So all you can say is there is even another group being voluntarily traumatized. And the number of traumatized people this war has already created and is creating every day is just unbelievable.
Yeah, with that said, we also thought about how to give the affected a voice, and of course we cannot have a child here on the panel, but we, as I mentioned, we have a video that we want to show. It's about 5 minutes, and it is from the also from the portal that was already mentioned by Elina, the Children of War. So that's the official Ukrainian portal by the government, supported by civil society, but this government run. And this story was discovered by a Ukrainian civil society initiative, the Reckoning Project, that was then transformed into a long, the Daily Mail feature story. But to the video of Sashko, the 12-year-old boy, which you are going to see from Mariupol, is on the government's website. But it's a vetted story, and that's, I think it's important for your context. So.
Мене звати Саша, мені 12 років. І я з березня місяця минулого року шукаю свою маму. Її звати Козлова Сніжана Михайлівна. Нас розлучили в фільтраційному таборі в селі Безиміно. Росіяни говорили, що я мамі не потрібен, що віддадуть в прийомну сім'ю в Росії. Уявіть, вони навіть не дали мені попрощатися з мамою. У нас не було ні світла, ні газу, ні води. Ми стояли коло мангала, готували їжу, тому що вдома неможливо було готувати. Та потім почався обстріл. І я почув вибух, мене оглушило. І потім я відчув, що в мене щось пече. Я відчув гарячий такий, наче уламок. Я кричав мамі, що в мене болить око, що в мене пече. Мама швидко мене відвела між гаражами, ми заховалися, переждали обстріл. Потім ми з мамою шукали медичної допомоги, щоб вилікувати моє око. Пішли на завод Ілліча. Там були військові медики. Вони обробили око, і ми сталися з ними на заводі. А вже на заводі закінчились боєприпаси і нас всіх взяли в полон. Російські військові нас посадили в КАМАЗи, як якихось тварин, і відвезли в якийсь ангар. Я сидів в фільтраційному таборі, чекав маму декілька годин, а її так привели, навіть не дали попрощатися. Та сказали, що мене від мами забирають. В інтернат відвезуть, і там уже мене прийме російська сім'я. Потім уже в Новоазовську лікарі сказали, щоб мене відвезти в Донецьк. Я спустя місяць випросив телефон в одного хлопця і так швидко в туалеті подзвонив до бабусі і на 1 хвилинку і розказав їй, де я знаходжусь.
24 лютого не було зв'язку. Я не знаходила собі місця, де ж мої діти, які знаходяться в Маріуполі. Але все-таки чекала, все-таки ждала, що все-таки хтось коли ж позвонить. Коли мені 19 квітня телефонує незнайомий номер, я говорю, хто? Саша каже, бабу, забери мене. Кажу, Саша, заберу, синочок, заберу, таки чекай. Давай збирати документи, щоб до нього приїхати. Мене відмовляли, мов, куди ти їдеш, тебе можуть прикрити і не випустити. А я кажу, як же ж не їхати, як там же ж моя кровинка. Вона мене чекає, мені треба по-любому їхати.
Місяць ждав і бабусю, і думав, може, мама приїде. А мама не приїжджала і не приїжджала. І коли вже бабуся приїхала, я переживав, щоб мене не забрали так, як і в мами.
У нас були такі емоції, що ми від радості плакали одне за одним. Я його хоч і забрала і повернула до себе додому. Але ж все-таки чекаємо на Сніжану. Надіємося, що вона все-таки, ми її шукаємо і надіємося, що вона повернеться до Саші, і я буду щаслива разом з ними.
Якби мене міг почути весь світ, то я б сказав, що треба швидше перемогти цю війну, щоб всі діти побачили своїх рідних, щоб всі батьки повернулися до себе до домівок, щоб обняли своїх рідних, та щоб все було добре в цій країні та в всьому світі.
Yes, this was one story of about 400 or 400 cases that are by now recorded of children that were successfully brought back by their relatives or legal guardians. So this is just one small case that got lucky. But we want to now in the second part look a little bit about what we can do, what we as European civil society can do and what we can demand from our governments. But I want to begin with Anna on a practical level, because we heard that being taken away from your family means a lot, and everyone can imagine that. But Anna, as a trained psychologist, like, how do we work with children and their families that are returning? Because a person that is returned is not automatically safe and good and in a good condition. So what is the psychosocial support that has to be given to those traumatized?
Yes, we will need to think of two kinds of psychosocial support programs. I think for two target groups. One target group could be families, and as we see also in this video, Sasha is an example of many children of whom one of the parents or both parents are missing or killed, or we don't know what happened to them, and so sometimes one of grandparents or another relatives or cousins take them. So these families, they definitely need a lot of support on trauma-informed care approach, on how to provide urgent mental health aid and different stress relief techniques for themselves, and also for the kid who will be returned, because they can have sleep problems, they can have problems with controlling their urine and other hygiene, and this can happen also to older, also teenagers or young people, those physiological issues, and also school children, they can have problems at school with concentration of attention, with memory. So teachers also need to learn how to integrate those kids into classrooms. And also then the question of propaganda, or I would say like propaganda delete program, unfortunately doesn't work as fast as it works on computer or on our smartphone, where you just press delete button. And especially with teenagers, you will need to work hard to practice democracy with them, and also how to work with issues, what Marie-Louise just said, that are speaking about history and controversial issues of history and the language. That's all like sensitive questions where teachers also need to be trained about that. And also one very important target group is state institutions, and state institutions that care about orphans and that care about foster families, because in Ukraine we have this process of going from those big state institutions for orphans, we are coming to families that are foster families, and definitely they will also need a special support for those cases.
Mm-hmm. That's perfect segue, because the report that we've already talked, Elina has segment recommendation, which is very important, but why don't you highlight some of what you believe to be the most important recommendations, well, both for Russia, but also for us in the West and Ukraine?
First of all, if I may, I would just like to underscore just how typical the story, what we just heard from that little boy, how many stories similar to that, regrettably, we heard as part of our mission. And I also wanted to also highlight this issue of separating child from a parent at the filtration point, how common it is. The other commonality, and I think this also goes a little bit to your question to Anna, if I may also, in terms of what can we do. A large proportion of children in Ukraine who were subjected to forceful deportation, actually, one might argue, and Russian authorities certainly do make that argument very loud and clear, went there voluntarily on so-called summer recreation camps. Yeah. In other words, the parents agreed initially, and agreed is a very generous way of putting it, were persuaded, and those who were not persuaded were pretty much muscled into allowing their children to go. These parents allowed their children to go for a couple of weeks under the pretense that your child is going to have a break.
To Crimea, if I may. You know, Crimea we're going to have a children's camp in Crimea, 2 weeks away from the war.
Yeah. Indeed. And so this is roughly about a year ago, last summer, when this phenomena, and then initially these parents were exceptionally ashamed that they allowed their children to go. And I think also within the society, broader society, both in Ukraine and outside, there was the, hold on a second, you let your child go? And I think it is very important when we talk about accountability to also step back a little bit and understand that those parents in Donetsk, for example, have been living under occupation since 2014. We talk about Ukraine war as in 2022 was something that happened. No, excuse me. Let's be honest, 2014 is when things started. And then those parents were in this absolutely impossible situation. And yes, they allowed their children to go and then never got their children back. So I think breaking that stigma is also very important for our discourse here and also within Ukraine to come to terms to that there is no shame. These parents are not to blame.
May I also add to what you are saying? There are accounts of liberated territories in Kherson region and also in Kharkiv regions where people were really starving. They really didn't have anything to eat. So parents agreed because, you cannot give your child something to eat.
Exactly.
So you agree for 2 weeks that your kid is going to Genichesk or to Crimea, whatsoever.
Yeah. And this again, this is a situation these families have been living for nearly 10 years. 2014. Let us not forget this absolutely impossible situation that these families are being put. And I think breaking that stigma and enabling these parents of saying, this is not your fault, you are not at fault, and therefore enabling them to report these cases is also a very important aspect. Sorry, I just had to say that because I think it's very important to understand this phenomena. It's not so straightforward. It's not just about, it's this impossible situation that has been created, that the country has been living since 2014, or regions of the country at least. You were asking about the recommendations, and I think Anna already mentioned a very important thing that I think is very important to understand, that in addition to dealing with this absolute horror of war that Ukraine has been put through, the country is also trying to carry out very important reforms in social care for children, oh, for goodness, I can't pronounce the word, but you all know what I mean. Moving from large-scale childcare institutions to more family environment so as to provide the children in need of care, a family environment rather than large institutions. And this is what the country is doing in the middle of the war. No? So you just imagine how difficult and how challenging that is, and that's not only financial support that is required, you also require expertise, and let us not forget that big proportion of the population, including experts in childcare, are carrying weapons right now, protecting their country. So that expertise, which is available here, elsewhere, is really, I think, needed in Ukraine as well in order to assist and support the country. What I think is also very important here to underscore a few initiatives that the government has undertaken in order to help the families to restore the links. In the video, you saw a grandmother who traveled to get her son. The reason, I speculate, but I suspect the reason why she could do that is that she was given a foreign passport to travel outside. Ukrainian government has adopted measures that in these instances, when a child is missing and you report it, you don't have to pay for this passport. They expedite the procedure so that you at least get your documents from Ukrainian side in order. Doesn't always necessarily mean that Russian side is not going to put additional burdens, additional obstacles in your place. And we recorded cases where families had to go twice, even 3 times, in order to provide all the documents that Russian authorities require to prove that the child is their kin. But nevertheless, so these sort of initiatives as well, again, is something that is very important to support. But it's the recommendations that you asked.
Very briefly, yes.
Very sorry. The key recommendation of the third Moscow mechanism that was triggered was the reunification of the families. We talk about accountability, and it goes without a doubt that this is absolutely essential. But as history has told us, accountability is something that could happen next year. It could happen 10 years down the road. We don't know. But these children, as Anna said, they don't have 10 years. Their identities are fundamentally altered as we speak. They don't have the time. So as Moscow mechanism, we ask that the absolute priority is the reunification of the families.
Excellent point. And I want to bring in Andrea again. As a foundation, I didn't mention you have in 2023 over 50 projects running with Ukraine. But as someone who knows the foundation landscape in the NGO world very well, like what can we as civil society actors actually do to expedite the unification or reunification of these families? How can we help from the outside?
I think it's a joint effort, and as was just said, and rightly so, accountability, the legal dimension, of course, is essential, is key. Already to come to terms with this dark chapter of history, or now it's the present, but we will have to eventually deal with those fates and with those crimes, and therefore accountability and legal aspects are of utmost important. Having said that, it is equally probably important that we prepare ourselves and continue and even raise our efforts to do educational measures. Why, I ask myself, can certain propaganda why does certain patterns of thinking work and operate, and why do they prosper with, let's say, those who take the children away? We also know that we need, very likely, at least I think there is no doubt, that there are state resources put into this scheme of abductions. We spoke about the naturalization process and so on, so there are resources put to this. So we will have to put resources on our end to educate about what happened, we have to put resources into documentation, about learning about these facts, also to what we do as we speak. We sit here and we try to raise awareness in Germany, a country that is a very potent member of the EU, which can contribute to a coherent and consistent strategy when it comes up to following the recommendations as put out in the report in other places in the UN and in the EU itself. Eurojust and Europol are cooperating. So I think it's very important that we have a holistic view on this. And you asked foundations and what we can do. It's of course civil society. It's the civil societies here in Germany, in the EU countries, raise awareness, support those who are so active and doing such a tremendous work in the Ukraine and also in Russia. Most likely we will have to strengthen informal civil society organizations who operate informally and behind the scenes. I believe you have experienced and encountered most likely those who are helping but cannot come out in the open because they are in danger themselves. So we have many ways to support and facilitate civil society structures and organizations. And in the present and in the future as well, we will have to do remembrance work because present is turning into memories, and we will have to deal with this, as I said before, in the decades to come.
Unfortunately, and just yesterday I started reading the new Russian history school book, and there you see many of the problems that you touched upon, that even with the non-deported Russians pupils, they are being indoctrinated about this ongoing war of aggression. Maria, I want to bring you in and slowly segue to the third part, which is the political and legal or judicial accountability. You are also Libmod, and you are a civil society actor. But I want to ask you first about what you think, given our German historical responsibility for Ukraine, given what in the name of Nazi Germany was committed in Ukraine, what you believe we could do to help Ukraine when it comes to the deportations, from a macro perspective or micro perspective.
Okay. When you started the introduction and said it's the 1st of September, I was expecting you to remind us that that was the day when Nazi Germany occupied Poland after having come to an agreement with Stalin that the Red Army would come from the other side. And if you speak to Ukrainians, they say the war did not start when Germany attacked the Soviet Union. For us, it started the 1st of September in 1939, because it already, this war, which had this agreement between those totalitarian systems from day number one, was affecting Ukrainians, because the borders had been shuffled around during the last centuries. So this is to start with. And yes, we can do a lot. I have always, besides the political work, tried to do some humanitarian work to support groups like you. I can tell you, collecting money from civilians is very easy on day number one and in the first 4 weeks when everybody is excited about a catastrophe. But as time goes on, it is almost impossible to raise private money. So what you need is from a certain day that big institutions take over financially. And unfortunately, even the German government has changed its politics, and they have diminished supporting small NGOs, and they are giving more money to big institutions. And small NGOs are not always the better ones. They are not always the most effective ones, but you still have a closer embedding in the society. And so I think this is a mistake in the politics our German government is doing. But let us come to the tough questions. I was a little irritated having a movie with a maybe 12-year-old boy, and it is on the Ukrainian government side, and he ends with, well, Ukraine has to win that war. It irritated me a little bit, whether really a 12-year-old who talks about his experiences would then come to this conclusion. But it is a message which is our message, and it is has to show us that all what we are talking about, accountability, maybe bringing some kids back, and there is even Russian initiatives who undercover try to find kids and bring them back to their parents. Help psychologists and treatments in a society where 7 million are out of the country, and mainly women and kids. And many of those women, of course, are doctors, psychologists, nurses, and so on. And if this next winter is going to be like we must expect it to be, again, the electricity is going to be hit by Russian rockets. We expect that the gas storages will be hit. So again, probably there will be a lot, maybe millions of people who will have to leave the country, and amongst them are those who would set up what we are talking about. So I think the truth is, yes, Ukraine has to win that war. And the truth is that it is up to us whether it has the chance to win that war or not. If you talk to Ukrainian soldiers or military people, they tell you, look at the numbers, Russia has much more soldiers. Putin does not care a second how many Russian young guys are coming from the territories or even being paid coming from Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan, those poor countries. So he doesn't care whether it will be 100,000, 200,000 or 300,000 soldiers which he will leave, which will be killed. On the Ukrainian side, there isn't so many people. So what they definitely need is technological, the most modern weapons. It is their only chance to overcome this Russian being stronger. And it is about time. And we have seen the more time we, hesitating as we are, give the Russian military, the more victims there are in the end. We see it now with this trying very, very carefully to have this offensive where we are already saying, well, doesn't look like the Ukrainians can really make it. So we have to be political in the end. And I know it's always much nicer to talk about humanitarian questions than talking about military questions. I know what I'm talking about. But for me, this is the truth. This Russian totalitarian system has to lose the war, just like a German totalitarian system had to be fought down by weapons 70 years ago.
I think that's a very important political message, and thank you, Marie, for also highlighting in passing that of the about 400 that were reunited, these children with their families or legal guardians, Russian civil society was actually instrumentally involved. We don't know the exact extent, but I would think it's more than a few because they're instrumental in organizing the transfer and helping with that. That's another question of how we can sustain that clandestine activities with those who are actually helping to reunify the families. But I want to ask you, Elina, as you're the only lawyer on the stage, I, in the introduction, mentioned that Putin and Lvova-Belova, they are wanted by the ICC, and as legal laymen, we think, okay, that's done, legal accountability is on its way, and it's just a matter of time. But please help us understand that what does it mean that Putin and Lvova-Belova, they were not yet charged? And how do you see other perpetrators of these deportation or forcible removals of the children? How do we get actually them to justice? How far away are we from that?
Yeah, it's a very, very complex question, of course. So first of all, in terms of the OSCE mission, we were very clear that we will, because what happened was that when mission was established 2 weeks subsequent to the issuance of the arrest warrants in respect to Mr. Putin and Madame Belova, so we were very clear and very careful. It was to not in any way interfere with whatever the International Criminal Court might be doing. But as we all know, the arrest warrants are out. And they are valid, and there are obligations upon the states to if they come in a physical possession, shall we say, of individuals so wanted, they ought to arrest them. And we already know that, although denied, we know that at least Mr. Putin is choosing his travel itineraries carefully, and most recently did not attend a particular event in the light of it. I suspect, although of course he would say very different, and he did say very different. But those arrest warrants, they are out there, but unless the individuals are in physical custody of the court, the normal proceedings cannot start. Because of course, when we talk about international fair trial proceedings, trying somebody in absentia is not something that I don't think that we would, as an international community, we would not accept that as right, because justice needs to be not only done, it also needs to be seen to be done. And those individuals who have been wronged have the right to have their say, their day in the court, and to stand there and to hear what those accused of those most horrendous crimes have to say. So that process by no means is fait accompli. We have to wait and see as an international lawyer. And the history tells us that, and here, if I may quote my own ambassador in Vienna, the wheels of the justice may be churning slowly, but they are churning.
They are turning indeed.
Indeed.
And we can only hope that accountability will proceed. But then I want to ask you from your perspective, from a Ukrainian perspective, how important is the accountability dimension in the here and now? We already heard that we should focus on reunifying the families and supporting them psychosocially and financially. But how important is the accountability dimension?
Yes, I think that accountability and justice is highly important for also self-respect and dignity issues. And also, I would like to say that now we need to operate with the notion of just peace, because it would safeguard our independence and territorial sovereignty, and also accountability for human rights violations and war crimes. And in the last 30 years, those concepts of peace, they turned more and embodied values of compromise and power sharing, and they were adopted like that because of the context of civil wars. And now we have an interstate war, and we need another concept of peace. We need the concept of just peace, justice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If I just may throw in, maybe our followers who have been listening to our EVZ conversations before, we had 3 Nobel Prize winners, Peace Prize winners on stage on Zoom, and then one of them was being awarded the Peace Prize from the Ukraine, and she said and really highlighted how important it is to heal. I mean, historically, psychologically, but as a nation as well. It is important, and this is where we, again, as foundations can come in, or civil society, to support the documentation, the gathering of evidence. We can encourage semi-professional also to gather documentation and evidence and pool it and bring it together. So I just wanted to add that. Also from those who are actively engaged in gathering documentation and evidence.
We will soon open the floor so you can gather your thoughts, and we'll introduce or give you the opportunity to ask questions to the panel. But maybe one of my last questions, I have more, but Marie, we already heard the genocidal component of all of this, and from this is, I understand, legally very complicated, as Elina could explain to us, but we're running slowly out of time. So how important do you think is this tag genocide? Because legally there are a lot of crimes that Putin and Russia and Russians, the perpetrators, could be tried for, but I know you're a proponent of this genocide term, so explain a little bit by why that in the accountability dimension is so important.
Well, if you remember, when Putin started this full-scale invasion, the war started 2014, he claimed that the Ukrainians were committing genocide on Russian civilians. So, and the Ukrainians made a very good move to immediately go to the international court, and it was fake news and propaganda. The genocide debate is difficult because in the during the years, it has in certain cases become something like a trophy. You know, it is, we still have the feeling genocide is the worst that can be committed. If you look at Nuremberg, they said the mother of all crimes is a war of aggression, because that is what is something like genocide making possible. If you listen to Philip Sands, he's proposing don't stick to this genocide term. Let's talk about crimes, about humanity, crime. So I personally, I'm deeply convinced that starting with how Mariupol happened, you have all the criteria of a genocide. There is a German professor, Professor Luchterhand, he already in March came up with an analysis, and the outcome was, I think, totally clear, and we should understand that, and we learned it with Bosnia, that genocide can be committed in a certain region. There it was Srebrenica, it was not all of Bosnia. So Mariupol, definitely, but since then we've seen Bucha, we've seen Izum, and other places. I think that the difficult question is when and where is this accountability going to start? And there you have this big debate about whether to have a court now in a hybrid format, which would mean the basis would be the Ukrainian law, and the court would be outside of Ukraine with international personnel. This is problematic because the Russians, of course, would say, oh, well, Ukrainians, look at them. I mean, it's nothing but revenge. It doesn't mean anything. So there is others fighting for a special tribunal. We have a German professor, Klaus Kress from Köln. He is the advisor to Karim Khan. And they are fighting for a special tribunal, which is a tribunal for wars. And here is the S very important, wars of aggression, which would mean that any war of aggression, even if the Americans marched into Iraq, there would be a possibility to go to court. Whether this will come is a big question. The Security Council cannot function. It would have to be the General Assembly. So others say, since we do have the ICC, and due to political reasons, historical reasons, this war of aggression is not part of their protocol of Rome. The fastest way would be to widen the portfolio of the ICC and enshrine this war of aggression.
Okay.
A very difficult and I think a very long way to go. And again, there will not be reunifications between the deported children and the families if Ukraine does not win the war. This is the truth, we know it. And so there will not be accountability of responsible person if Ukraine does not win the war. If we go for support those compromises, you know, why don't you divide the country and what is the problem about it? There will not be accountability there.
That's a very important point, and I think we have a lot of food for further EVZ conversations, just the legal, as you can tell, the legal questions, even for laymen like us, other than Elena, the questions of legal matters are very, very important when it comes to this war. But I'm now looking into the audience to see whether there are questions directed to the panel. There will be a microphone. Yes, I see one hand in the back. If you could introduce yourself and direct the question to one of the panelists.
My name is Dmitry Pudinsky. Thanks very much for the panel. It was very interesting. There we go. All right. I had a question about the logistics of these individual cases of reunification between the families and the children. Specifically, I always wondered how those come to be. So Ukrainian family members have to cross into Russian or Russian-occupied territory, and I'm just wondering, they do that with Ukrainian documents. You talked about foreign passports, and for a moment I was wondering whether you have like fake Latvian passports being handed out or something. But you probably just mean Ukrainian passports, since not everyone has one.
You have to have two.
Right. Okay.
So I suppose for those of us who've lived in a former Soviet space, you used to have a passport which was your valid ID within the country, but for abroad travel you had the foreign passport. So that system is still operational in Ukraine.
Okay, and the other thing I wondered about was what border do you cross? Do you cross through some of the...
You have to go around. You can't go through the war zone. You go through the active war zone.
So around means you go through the Baltics, for instance?
Yeah.
Okay, but you couldn't cross at any of the direct borders between Russia and Ukraine? No. Okay. Yeah. And so the Russian authorities basically receive documents and review those, and then they give you a green stamp for Ukrainians. Sorry?
Or not.
Or not.
I can give you an example, and I'm not going to mention any names, but we recorded a case, and that's recorded in the report, of a single mother. Her son went on this recreation camp that I mentioned. She allowed him to go, and then he wasn't returned. And then because the son is a teenager, he had a phone, so similarly to the boy in the video, he was able to call and say of his whereabouts, and his mom went to get him. So the Russian authorities, first of all, required her to prove that this is her son, but she had those documents with her. And then they said, well, where is the consent of the father? I'm a single mother. They made her go back and get a spravka, a note from Ukrainian authorities to prove that there is no known father. And only then, second time, and it usually takes roughly 3 days to travel, because again, you cannot travel by air, etc., that she was able to get her son back.
May I also add, because Russians are not only checking your passport, but they also check what you have on your smartphone, what you have on your social networks. And in the research and documentary made by Kyiv Independent, you can watch it online. There is a story of a policewoman in Mariupol, whose both children were abducted, and then her mom, grandmother, needed to go to Russia to take them because she is a policewoman, and she cannot do so. It would be a way of one end.
It's a very important case, and your question was important because in this story, because it illustrates how difficult these reunifications are. Yeah, we have about 400 of those documented, but each involves a lot of people to find, identify the individuals and get all the documents and get the children. And we have 400 successful cases, but there's a great number for those who failed. So thank you very much for this good question.
Has there been a single case of a man being able to do that trip?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. There's actually, coincidentally, there's a case also documented in the report, but also was very widely reported in the press, of a single father with 3 children. He was separated from his children at the filtration point, so similar story to here. But of course, as a man, he was immediately suspect of being involved as a Ukrainian combatant, or whatever is the appropriate title that Russian authorities would afford in this instance. So he was detained, from the top of my head, I think he was in filtration camp for about 2 months. Didn't know whether he would be able or not, and then he was let out. And coincidentally, the Russian authorities had custody of his 3 children. He was released, and the next day they sent the children away, I believe, to Moscow, knowing very well that the father is elsewhere in the filtration camp. And then the eldest son got hold of the mobile phone, managed to call the dad and said, look, if you don't come, they're sending us to fostering. And he managed to travel and get them.
There are further questions. This case is, we were thinking about showing this case. It's also a video documentary made out of that. That's for the Vanity Fair. There's a big feature story on exactly this father. So it's a very, very good documentary if you're interested in that. But it's just a little bit longer, so we didn't show this case. I'm looking into the round. Oh yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Mary. I want to ask about a simple but important complication to the story. You know that a major part of those kids are in Belarus. So
not major, but part. Yes.
so, like, at least, yeah, that's the information I know. You know better, of course. But like, those kids are not only known to be there; they are also filmed. Their faces are shown. It is sad how happy they are in this whatever recreational places. So I just wonder if this process is going to be started also against Lukashenko, because I also have a personal interest in that.
So a Belarus angle. I wonder who wants to take that.
I'm happy to take, because I mean, again, so when it came down to the specific report where I served as an expert, this was in relation to Russia, but we could not ignore evidence also, and certain testimonies were received in relation to Belarus. Interestingly enough, when we presented the report to the Permanent Council of the OSCE, Belarusian delegation took floor and vehemently denied any wrongdoing on the matter. But when it comes down to the report, it's not the subject of it. What we did receive also, some of the evidence, is that the Belarusian authorities were, in the instances that were reported to us, were more helpful to reunite the families, if I could make more comparison in relation to Russian families. And we certainly are nowhere near the scale of what we see vis-à-vis Russia. If that's helpful, that's from my side.
Point somewhere here? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Eva Kristrup, and I agree fully with Marie-Louise Beck, a former colleague, what political and military questions, especially Germany, has to solve and to go on. But as I was involved in the tragedy and war of Bosnia too, I have one question on the humanitarian level. At that time, we organized holidays for children of the war. And could it be a sort of European campaign, especially with Poland and Czechoslovakia? I think the countries nearer in the neighborhood and nearer in the historic memory, that maybe some foundations together could organize holidays for children in war, but just do it with politically clear as a counter initiative, and maybe even as a help for these parents. They say, we have been betrayed. It was a psychological warfare against these parents, but that we could maybe organize something like that. And another question is, I had bad experience with the Red Cross, even in the time with Bosnia, and related to Belarus too, I had bad experience with the Red Cross. I'm asking, though I should know it, but I'm asking myself, what is the role of the Red Cross in all that? And is it as bad as it was with Theresienstadt?
That's a difficult one. Maybe, Anna, we begin with you, because I know that you're organizing summer camps for displaced children, and you had plans to involve some of the affected children of these deportations.
Yes, in 2015 we came out with the idea of a rehabilitation program called Building Bridges, Not Walls, for kids that were affected in Donetsk and Lugansk regions, and other kids were from more like peaceful regions, so they can enrich each other. And this concept was based on different workshops that those teenagers can try different things that can help them to identify what I like most, what I can do well, what is my inner strengths. And together with Natalia, who is here in the audience, we have done those projects. But now, since this full-scale invasion, now the tasks, like it's in computer game, the next level, because like we don't have healthy or stable. Also, our cells are not very stable. Yeah, I came from Kiev, and I slept well only the last night in Berlin. So we also need help. Yeah, so we also sometimes try to work on this rest and recuperation scheme, and we need support of volunteers and educators and mental health specialists from Europe and also from Germany to enrich and to build this safe space for those teenagers and families to recover and then be able to be a resilient adult.
Mm-hmm. And then the difficult question of the role of the Red Cross. I'm not sure who feels...
Well, my when I was investigating in Donetsk region, it was just the fact that the International Red Cross did not get access, not to the places where people were being contained, not to the prisons. They had no chance. Everybody knew that the situation in the prisons were horrible. A lot of HIV and tuberculosis, and that prisoners who had been regular prisoners from the time before 2014, but were unhappy enough to have their prison in Donetsk or Lugansk, that they were not let out when their time was over. But Belarus, I know that from Belarus also, and from those regions in Ukraine, which were the self-appointed regions, it could not, it really could not act, you know. So I think for the International Red Cross, you always have the problem, if they really want to help people, they should better not speak out what they see and what is happening. If they do tell what they see and what is happening, it's the end of the access. So I think it's really a very, very difficult decisions they have to make, and thus when you talk to them, they try to be as unpolitical as can be, which in reality is not possible, but it's a dilemma, and to which side you then in the end decide to end a dilemma, this is a question which you can't really say from the outside, unless you have the feeling this case is so clear that they turn to be collaborators. And when you have this feeling that the International Red Cross, with the interpretation that they are helping people, you have the feeling now they are helping, then they are collaborators, but then they must decide to withdraw. And it's very often a very difficult decision.
Yeah, there was recently a scandal from the Red Cross from Belarus. Someone from the national board, I believe, of the leadership of the Belarusian Red Cross was in the Donbass with a Z sign helping, or at least what it appears to be helping in the Russian occupied areas. So there are certain scandals. But we're bumping at the end, so I'm looking maybe at the panel. One last question from the audience. Okay, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you also so much for being so clear in your statements. My question goes back to the direction of accountability and adds to the question we just had, because for me the question is, I'm not just looking at the head of governments or people who are making those decisions, but when does accountability start in the system we're seeing in different countries, not just one country? What are the legal instruments we have at hand for just following those systems? And when does accountability start? People knowing what is happening, is it already enough? Do you have an opinion or thoughts on that? Thank you.
Elena, I think that's your turf.
I think, well, no pressure. I think, first of all, what is very important for us to remember is that whatever starts at home. This is what I always tell my children, and I think it's also on a state level, it's important for us to remember. There are certain things that we, in each of our country, can do to put our ducks in a row, as they say in English. So, example, it was, now I'm on the spot and I'm mixing up, whether it was Luxembourg or Liechtenstein, which granted its citizenship to Putin and Belova, so that if they come to that country, they can be arrested. Now, this is the requirement of national law, that they can only arrest national and extradite national. So they gave them bloody citizenship, I'm sorry, in order to facilitate that, should they dare to happen. I'm pretty sure it was Luxembourg, but it could have been also Liechtenstein. I apologize. So these are sort of things that can happen. What we see now happening in Ukraine, with the support of Eurojust and Europol, we see first prosecutions by the Ukrainian prosecutors of war crimes. Obviously, when it comes down to individual criminal responsibility, you actually need to find that physical individual, to have that individual in your custody, and you need to build your case, you need your mens rea, you need your intention, you need to prove the full case, because justice needs to be full, and full fair trial proceedings, etc., need to be afforded, or otherwise this will be just lynching, isn't it? I mean, if the shoe was on the other foot. So all of this needs to happen, and it can happen in the case of Ukraine right now because that support is being afforded to the prosecutorial services, primarily through the work of the Attorney General's office, which is supported by various things. So I think when we talk about accountability, I think what's very important is that for each of our countries is to look at our national legal system. Do we have that in order? Ukraine needed to have a special extension in order to enable ICC to take these cases, the International Criminal Court, right? Do all of our jurisdictions have our ducks in order so that should they step on our soil, we are legally able to arrest them? These sort of things is a forward thinking that is absolutely paramount from the legal perspective of accountability that needs to take place.
Thank you so much. That serves more or less as a closing word. I think it's impossible.
But it's the possibility of the German general prosecutor, and this process has started in Germany. Sabine Leuthäuser-Schnarrenberger and former Minister Baum, they initiated that the German general prosecutor is forced to already collect witnesses for in case that any of those people who have committed crimes, if they come to Germany, are being brought to court here. And we have had first cases from Syria, I guess you all know about it, that people who have been torturers in Syria and who came to Germany, they were recognized, arrested here, brought to court. So I mean, it means something. It means that at least those people who are committing crimes as Russian citizens or soldiers, whatever, they at least should know that for them traveling to Germany, they should better not risk.
Yeah, this is the Weltrechtsprinzip. Yeah, I don't know the English term for that, but I know that we have to wrap up at this point because the theater will be used later on. So I will not attempt to summarize this discussion. Just say it is a very, very important topic because it goes again in the essence of the Ukrainian, what it means Ukrainian nationhood. And I think we discussed that today, that children are not just people of the future, but people of the moment. And we need to do everything to reunite those who were forcefully relocated, deported, and that is very important. So this topic remains important, not just for EVZ. I know that next week there is another event in the German Bundestag on the children deportations, and there is already this Kiev Independent feature story, this documentary that was mentioned. I highly recommend that. So I really hope that everyone here takes this topic with them and we continue discussing what we can do as individuals, but also as our governments and our civil society. So thank you very much for EVZ and all the panelists here, and I hope you found this discussion as insightful as I did.